Good morning, everybody. Don't be shy. This is going to be a fun day. I think it's important to start out by acknowledging that we're located on unceded indigenous lands. I'm going to try and pronounce this properly, I apologize. The Kanien'kehá:ka Nation is recognized as the custodians of the lands and the waters, including, look out here, this beautiful forest to our side, on which we gather today. It's historically known, Montreal is historically known as a gathering place for First Nations. And today it's home to a wide range of populations, including Indigenous and other peoples. And I think it's important to acknowledge and respect the continued connections that we have with the past, with the present, and with the future, and with nature in an amazing setting like this in our ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other people within the Montreal community. And I should point out, we're going to be doing a proper land acknowledgement ceremony on Thursday morning, or no, Wednesday afternoon, but I think it's important to acknowledge this as we start off the day today. All right, as Sage said, I've done a lot of stuff, mostly a consequence of ADHD, and I'm going to try and wrap all of that into an hour and 20 minutes this morning, so I hope you're here for a wild ride. The most boring slide of my deck is the first one. There'll be funny videos later, but I think it's really important to look at where we are, because behind you is another stage called the funding stage, and this is the founding stage. And there's a huge difference between the problems that people face in the early founding stages and what they need when they're getting money. More specifically, you start out with a problem and a solution, and you say, I have this founding idea. I think I can build a business around this. And then you say, I have a business model hypothesis. I have a business model I think is going to work. And then you have to go to the market and confirm that that model actually works. If you found this mythical product market fit, now you can say, okay, I found a problem, I found a solution, and then can I scale my business? Can I continue to grow? And there's different stages of funding for this. So the early stages are obviously self-funded or angel-funded, and then you go through seed and convertible debt and eventually Series A, Series B, and an IPO. And your revenues change over this time too. So early on, you have no revenues. And then as you grow, your revenues aren't really to pay the bills. They're to validate that there's a demand. They're to show that people are adopting it. And then you start to bring in revenues. First 10,000 a month, 100,000 a month. And the rule of thumb for scale stage companies is that you're doing at least $500,000 a month. I will say this across having talked to hundreds of startups. Everybody thinks they're further along than they are. This is the single biggest problem with the startup ecosystem, premature scaling. And I'm going to explain why for the rest of this talk. In the founding stage, you have a working business model that you need to prove. You have to show, hey, I've got this problem and this solution lead to business. Then you need to prove that you have product market fit. And at the end, you need to prove, can I scale the business? My culture is going to change, but can I keep the soul of my company? Can I add employees? Can I add processes without undermining the enthusiasm that I got later on? And you don't need to read this eye chart. All you need to know is we're here today to talk about the pink stuff. Here's a dirty secret. Half the people in that room should be in this room. They think they're here to learn how to get funding, but they're not fundable yet. You're the smart audience because you're here to learn how to get fundable. And I can say that without compunction because I'm not speaking on that stage. So the first and most obvious question, should you be a startup? There are 3 fundamental decisions you need to make to decide if you should even be a startup. And I know it's weird to talk about that at Startupfest, but many of you should not be founding a startup. And there's nothing wrong with that. When we wrote Lean Analytics, Ben Yoskovitz and I talked to a bunch of people, but one of the things that really stuck out is this chart by a guy named Bud Cadell. And he says you should work on the things that consume you. That means the things that you can do well, the things that are what you want to do, that are fulfilling and fun, and the things that you can be paid to do. Those are the 3 fundamental criteria for working on something. If there's something that you can't be paid to do, but you do it well and you love to do it, you should devote yourself to figuring out how to monetize that thing. If there's something that you do well and can be paid for, but you hate, probably your current job, then you have to learn how to say no to that stuff. And if there's something that you want to do and can be paid to do, but you're not very good at it, you got to learn to do it better. And in the middle is yay. You found a startup idea, go do it. I believe this should be on the wall of every high school counselor in the world. This is the map to having a fulfilling career. And we don't talk about this enough, so this is my first criteria. If you're not in the yay center, figure out another startup or go do something else. Because it is going to consume your life and make you a nightmare to loved ones for years if you do it right. And if it isn't in the middle, you are probably wasting precious years of your life. The other question about this is, what's your tolerance for uncertainty? There's a reason that startups tend to be started by either people with nothing to lose, early in their lives, few responsibilities, who can afford to live on ramen with a roommate for a few years, or people with incredible privilege, who come from money, have had several startups and don't mind losing. Dirty secret, the second group are less desperate because they can go back to being rich. So the real challenge here is to figure out if you can afford to lose. Either you have nothing to lose or you can afford to lose. That is the biggest challenge. It's also why so much of Silicon Valley is backed by people who came from privilege and went to the best colleges, typically straight white dudes, is because this idea of privilege allows you to take the risks that are not available to most people. Most people have to put meals on their table, they have to care for kids, that kind of stuff. You have to find a way to be tolerant of uncertainty. Maybe that's working in a job and having a side gig. Maybe that's taking a year's sabbatical. Maybe it's doing it out of college instead of a gap year traveling Europe. And the reason you have to tolerate uncertainty is that an incredibly high number of businesses fail. This is the depressing statistics. By year 10, 71% of all businesses have gone. A quarter of them die in the first year. And this is all businesses. This includes every industry. It is way worse if you segment that by information technology companies. After 4 years, only 37% of all IT companies still exist. And that includes things like tech consulting companies. So you're probably going to go out of business. You're probably going to go, that thing you're dreaming about right now, even if it's something you care about, will probably fail. This is the feel-good talk of the day. The good news is that you're in the right place. Because if you pay attention to the content we've put together today and tomorrow, you will dramatically reduce the chances of that failure. Why do those businesses fail? Well, it turns out 52% of them fail because of incompetence, emotional pricing, living too high on the business, not paying your taxes, lack of planning. So if you're competent, you're already better than half the market. That's good. 34% fail because of managerial experience. They don't understand. They expand too rapidly, the premature scaling I referred to earlier. They don't manage credit properly. 13%, it's because they lack industry experience. They tried to solve a problem, but they weren't familiar with the industry. They're doing doctor scheduling, but they don't understand how doctors schedule their lives, for example. Only 1% are because of neglect, fraud, or disaster. So, if you're competent and you don't scale too fast and you can afford to lose, those are very good precursors to having a successful startup. So the first question is, should you found a startup? And if the answer is no, you should go work for one because they're awesome. And someone else is getting the risk. You won't get the rewards, but it's an amazing experience. And if you have a chance to go work for a startup, you'll increase your chances of success because you'll know the facts. So if you aren't ready for this right now, that's fine. There's no shame in not being a startup. You have an idea. Many times, that idea could be donor-based. You look at companies like Wikipedia. You look at platforms like Kickstarter and Patreon. Maybe your idea is a project, and that's okay. In lean analytics, there's a missing business model we purposely didn't put in because the book wasn't very lean and we didn't want to make it any thicker. But the business model is essentially nonprofit. And what we learned from talking to people who had very successful Kickstarters is that more than half of their donors didn't want the thing they were selling, but they wanted the thing they were selling to exist. If you have a thing you want to build and you can monetize people who also want it to exist, then you have a significant advantage. You can also be a consultancy. C'est un peu bruyant ici, je sais pas si c'est des problèmes de son. It's sounding really reverby up here. I don't know if that's... It's okay? You guys can hear me? I don't care what it sounds like. Okay. So the second thing is you can be a consultant. You may have domain knowledge, and it turns out this is a really good way to test out a market. We'll come back to that later. But all you need to know is that if you understand a technology and other people don't, there's money to be made. Maybe the money isn't made in selling them a product, but there's certainly money to be made in consulting, and then you'll gain some of that domain expertise that allows you to enter the market. Obviously, if a startup, you have a hypothesis for some kind of scalable, repeatable business, that's good, that's why you're here, but you may also want to be an entrepreneur. Entrepreneur just means I'm going to run an existing business. I'm going to launch a restaurant or whatever, a franchise, local company, that's fine too. So if you've decided that yes, you want to do a startup, the next question is, should you go and seek investment? You don't necessarily need money to start a startup. You could bootstrap it. Should you go and get investment? Well, the real question here is, will you provide returns to your investor? It's not about whether your business is good. They don't care. It's whether the investor can expect to get 3 times to 10 times their money back in 3 or 4 years. Sometimes 10 years if it's a long haul. That's the question about whether you should get investment. Can you give an investor back 10 times their money in a reasonable time frame? If you look yourself in the mirror and say, I have $100 in my bank today, am I willing to give someone $1,000 in 3 years' time? If the answer is no, this is not the right thing to do. Because it gets even worse. Let's say that you start a successful company and you do a Series A raise or a seed round and you raise $10 million, you have a $10 million valuation, of which $2 million is the money you raised from VCs. Seems pretty good, right? You now have some money, you got $2 million in the bank. You grow the business. It's now worth $20 million. Someone shows up and says, hey, I'd like to give you $20 million for your business. Remember, you gave away 20% of the company, so you're going to give your investor $4 million, and you're going to have $16 million. Would anybody like that deal? You start a company, and in 2 years, you get $16 million back? Who wants that? If you don't, you should be definitely in another conference. The problem is that the VC is going to say, I'm sorry, you can't take that deal. Because they've only made twice their money back, and they want 10 times their money back, which means you got to sell the company for $100 million for them to get their money back. So they're going to say no. In fact, the more interest someone expresses in buying your company from you, the more likely the VC is to say no, because you've just sent them a very strong signal that you're the unicorn in their portfolio, which means they're going to force you to change your business structure and probably replace you, make you head of strategy or something. This is what happens if you get money. That's a difficult, I know this is a bitter pill to swallow, but that's the reality of how this works. So how do you make a scalable, repeatable, sustainable business that brings you all that revenue? There's a few seats at the front here with tables if you want to come on up here. Folks who have space, maybe folks over there, I don't know if you want to like defrag the room and move in a little bit, leave the AV guy there, but it'd be great if you could make a little room for the people that are arriving. And there are some seats up here with tables if you want to put your notebooks out, so come on up. So the first question is, do I have a startup? And I like using this example because the thing you need to learn when you look deep inside yourselves about your business, because this is a lot about introspection, is do I have a new venture? A hair salon, if you launch a hair salon, that's not a startup. It's an honorable, noble business, but it's not a startup. Steve Blank, who's like the godfather of the lean startup movement, defines a startup as an organization designed to search for a sustainable, repeatable business model in conditions of high uncertainty. That means that an entrepreneur is someone who comes in and knows the business model and can out-execute the competition. I set up a hair salon, I know the hair salon world, I can set it up. There's much less risk, but there's also less reward. And your job is kind of to steal the best practices of others and improve on them. On the other hand, a startup founder is looking for a new, unknown business model. Their job is to discover a product and a market. They have a lot of risk, but they also have a lot of reward, and their job is to define and invent things. They're very different models. I do a lot of speaking to entrepreneur organizations who have not realized that everyone calls themselves a startup. In fact, I was in Barbados for an event called Startupfest, because in Barbados it turns out that trepping is like the word for entrepreneurship. I love it. They're like, yeah, man, we be trepping. But one guy had cornered the market on importing some good that he was the only person for, so he's like a startup entrepreneur because you got to buy that, I don't know, box of cereals from him. Amazon was about to launch in Barbados. And I'm like, I love your exclusivity, but that's not a long-term strategy. So there's a huge difference between entrepreneurship and startups. In a startup case, the goal is to discover a new business model in an uncertain environment. That means that your job is to learn more than to execute. You're trying to discover. Once you've discovered it, it's time to scale. But your job right now is to learn. And so you're searching. Your goal is to learn stuff, right? So the things you need to search for are something that has really good economics. Ultimately, remember, you're going to return money to someone. You've decided to be a startup, you're getting funding, you're returning money to somebody. It means you have to worry about economics. Whether you like late-stage capitalism or not, you have to focus on returns for your investors. So Do you have reasonable acquisition costs? Can you acquire customers for a reasonable amount? I mean, it'd be great to sell things to billionaires, but if you can't get their attention, you can't acquire their interest, it's not very useful. Do those customers have what we call a high residual lifetime value? How much money is left in the pocket of a customer once they become a customer? Do they return to buy something again, or is it a one-time purchase? Are they likely to churn out or abandon their thing after a month or 2 years? Will they buy more things from you and upgrade their service over time? Slack has a great valuation because Slack has the ability to attract and retain customers. And then the third thing is, can you emerge as a market leader? Because if you found a market like this, well, the world's full of smart people. So other people are also going after that market. And in the early stages, everybody grows because there's a lot of market. But very quickly, some competition emerges. And so the third question any investor will have is, can you build a competitive moat around what you do? Either because of user adoption, brand awareness, intellectual property, all kinds of things like that. There's some more seats at the front, folks. If you want to sit down, there's a couple here on these tables too. So the first question is it sustainable? You need these three things. And the second question is it repeatable? That means, is it ready for standardization and automation? Because you're going to have to grow the business faster than you grow your costs in order to become profitable and preserve margins. So not only is it sustainable, I could do all of this stuff as a consulting company, but I have to add employees as I grow in order to consult. So it doesn't get to the scalable, sustainable part. And so the question is, after I'm done searching, after I found that thing as a startup founder, can I become or hire executives to execute on that efficiently, control costs, grow the business, and so on? The way to do this properly is to identify the riskiest assumption in your business. So you have to look at this with the lens of the most risk. And I find for startup founders, this is the part that's hardest because you love your idea. You're passionate about it. It's going to change the world. It's going to make you rich. You found an opportunity, but you're in your own filter bubble. I used to have a t-shirt that said, "Your mom is not a valid test market." Although my mom's actually in the audience there, so she's pretty smart at this stuff too. Hi, Mom. Yeah, there are 3 generations of Crolls at the conference this year. So knowing what the riskiest assumption is a very difficult thing to do. You have to look deep within yourself because you're probably wrong. And I'll talk more about what the risk is almost always that founders ignore in a few minutes. Back to the hair salon. A hair salon is not searching. What's the biggest problem in a hair salon? Customers. The hair salon business model is not about cutting hair. I mean, the problem that a hair salon solves is that human hair grows. And the solution is we cut human hair. But the business model is I fill seats. If you can fill your seats 100% of the time, then stylists will line up to work for you. And I was able to find clip art of an international hairstyling competition, the most fabulous haircuts you've ever seen at a competition. But if you can fill seats all the time, the stylists will line up to work for you. That's not your problem. Your problem is filling seats. Your problem is not... So the risk in your business, even though you may say, I'm really good at cutting hair, who cares? Are you really good at filling seats? That's your business model. It requires ruthless honesty. If you're an amazing stylist, you're naturally going to increase your perceived value of your hairstyling skills. So a good question, and I had this conversation at a hair salon, literally talking to the owner of the hair salon while she cut what little hair I have. And halfway through, I told her this, and she starts telling me, well, we could build an app that tells me tells our customers when they're within 2 minutes of walking away or whatever, that there's a free seat. We could build reservation systems with discounts for low times. We could do variable pricing. And she keeps going on and on. And then she goes, why don't these things exist? And I said, now you're a founder. Because now you're thinking about how to change the underlying business risk. You're not worried about what kind of haircut to give me. I think I can tell you what kind of haircut to give me. You're worried about the business problem. So what would a hair salon startup look like? I've given a lot of thought to this idea of different levels of innovation. There are, I think, 4 kinds of innovation that happen in organizations. Lots of people have written about this before. There's Horizon 1, Horizon 2, Horizon 3. There's Clay Christensen's sustaining and disruptive innovation. But the reality is There are 4 different kinds of innovation. The first is what's called sustaining innovation. That's just what you do at your job. If you work in any company, your job is to do something well so that you will grow market share and continue to pull in revenues. There's adjacent innovation, which is where you change either the product or the market or the way in which you go to market. There's disruptive innovation, which is where you build something that destroys the existing business. And this is why so many big companies have a hard time disrupting themselves, because to do so means they step on the oxygen hose of their existing revenues. And then there's discontinuous innovation, which is like the world's going to change. We don't know how, but we got to think about it. So let me give you a concrete example. If you're Mercedes-Benz, sustaining innovation is, I have a new car. It's the 2020 model. It's a darker color of black. It's got more cup holders. And that's great, and it's a noble thing, but it's not a startup. It's your job to continue to improve those business metrics. So you're incrementally improving the business. Adjacent innovation is something like the electric car. I'm still selling to drivers. I'm still selling through dealerships, but I'm selling them a new product, the electric car. Disruptive innovation is Car2Go, and Car2Go is actually owned by Mercedes-Benz. And the more people that drive using Car2Go, the fewer people buy cars, therefore it undermines the previous business model. Yay to Mercedes-Benz for having embraced that and focused on Car2Go. Discontinuous innovation is the self-driving car. We don't know what the world's going to be like when cars drive themselves. People will look at us and say, wait, they used to let you drive? What if you hit someone? They'll say, how did you shave in the morning? What about your morning video conference? They won't understand what it was like to have a car that you had to drive yourself. That's a discontinuity. It's a thing you don't understand. Best definition of marketing I've seen, which relates to sustaining innovation, is from the CMO of Coca-Cola, who said, marketing is selling more things to more people for more money, more often, more efficiently. I suspect he's pro-lower taxes. That's a hell of a statement. But it means things like, how do you sell more things? How do you add inventory to your product offering? How do you sell them to more people with virality, with lower incremental order costs? How do you maximize the money with price skimming or maximizing shopping carts? How do you get them to do it more often? With nudges, with loyalty, with demand prediction? And finally, how do you do it more efficiently so your margins stay the same, with automation and so on? That's what every company should be doing. If all you do is this, you're probably not a startup. To put it a different way, you have the sustaining innovation, which is Sergey Zimon's thing. You have changing the market, the method, or the product. So changing who you sell to, how you sell it, or what you sell. You have disruptive innovation, where you're changing more than one of those things at a time. And then you have full-on startup, where you're like off in the crazy weeds because you're taking that risk that may turn into a real product down the road. Let me give you another example of these 4 maxima or 4 humps. For Blockbuster, the video company, sustaining evolution would have been more of the same. Just funding more movies, opening up new stores, supporting the Oscars, that kind of stuff. Adjacent innovation might have been the introduction of Blu-ray discs. So we had DVDs. Blu-ray was a new product, but it was still sold in the same way through rentals to the same customers, people who worked in those environments. Disruptive would be something like Netflix, which is a fundamentally new business model. It's a new method, streaming instead of rental delivery. It's a new product, monthly subscription, and there's no video stores, and it kills the video stores. So that was a true startup. Discontinuous innovation. I've given a lot of thought to what discontinuous innovation would be like in the video industry. Some of you may have seen this last year in a talk I did, but here's the really discontinuous change in video content. We have new content economics. So this is a video on YouTube of someone I'm not going to show you the video because you'd go nuts. It's someone taking a plastic egg, opening it up, taking something out of it, holding it to the camera, putting it aside. They do this for 10 minutes. This video has 652 million views. Let that sink in. 652 million views. What's interesting is not that the cost of media has gone down. If you were trying to reach 652 million viewers, you would pay hundreds of millions of dollars in advertising to do that. That's more than twice the population of America. Today, it isn't just that got free. I could take a video of this room, and if it went viral, hundreds of millions of people could see it at no cost to me. That's remarkable. The new economics is I would make a ton of money if that happened. This person made money because of this video. So it's not that the cost of content came to nothing. It's that the cost of content has changed. You don't pay to broadcast widely. You get paid for it. That's the fundamentally discontinuous world where we pay people for the more attention they can get to their content. It's more than just video is free. It's the economics of burst. So where should your startup be? Well, it's probably not in the first part. That's pretty boring. There's no profits, no exits. If you're good at this, go work for a big company, charge them an outrageous salary, get a percentage of increased revenues, and make yourself rich. That's fine. It's probably not all the way over in discontinuous innovation. Certainly, we're pushing innovation on self-driving cars, for example, through companies like Tesla and Uber, through Google's Waymo product, but also through academia. And it's hard to monetize that stuff. Even companies like Uber or Tesla have an existing model, and now they're trying to innovate within it. So the best place to start up is either in this adjacent category where you take a known business model, you change one thing, or if you have domain expertise in a core technology that disrupts something. Most people say startups disrupt. This is what they mean. Tell me what you're destroying. If you can't tell me what industry you're destroying, you're probably not disruptive. So back to the hair salon. A new approach to hair salons, and I was amazed to discover this already exists with Keep Cut, is unlimited haircut memberships. It's like Netflix haircuts. So you pay once and you can get your hair done as much as you want. That's an example of an adjacent, so they're still doing haircuts, they're still doing it to people with hair, but now they're doing it on a monthly fee basis instead of a per visit basis. They've innovated on their go-to-market method. They are an adjacent form of innovation and they're testing that out. Now let's say you make products for bald people. You have a hair salon for bald people. And all it does is shine lasers in your hair and spray Rogaine on them. You could do that. That's a whole new market. You're still providing hair solutions on a visit basis, but you're doing it to a new market, people like me who don't need their haircut. Or, and this is my absolute favorite, and welcome to the 80s, if you haven't seen it already, you could introduce a new product. This is the Flowbee. It attaches to the end of your vacuum cleaner. It has spinning blades in it, and you can do it at home, but I have not seen pop-up monthly rental Flowbee hair salons. So if any of you wants to do this, I give this to you free. There's another problem you have to think about when you're a startup, which is, are you a roof rack or a steering wheel? Think about the markets for roof racks and the markets for steering wheels. If you're selling steering wheels, you're either selling to a car manufacturer, your supplier, or you're selling to very specific hobbyists who spend a lot of money tricking out their car. If you're selling roof racks, you're selling that roof rack to anyone. Thule is a very big company. You can move your roof rack from car to car. A lot of people build a startup that they think is a product, but it's actually a feature of something else. If you're building a thing, there was a company that did cloud management tools for Amazon Web Services. They were huge for about 3 years until it was obvious that Amazon needed to build management tools for its cloud services, and they went out of business. They thought they were building a roof rack. It turns out they were building a steering wheel. And they can either go sell their thing to Amazon, or Amazon's going to crush them and make their own. And so a really difficult thing to understand is, how do you make your company a self-contained thing that people need on its own, as opposed to something that's such an integral part of something else? A car won't work with a steering wheel. A car will work with a roof rack. Amazon Web Services won't work without a management console, so that's probably a steering wheel company. So another really deep in your stomach litmus test, ask yourself a hard question is, am I actually building a steering wheel when I should be building a roof rack? You have to ask yourself, what's the atomic thing the customer can buy on its own that will live on its own as opposed to being a function of someone else? And there's a term for this called spotlighting, where Apple used to have Apple Spotlight, the search tool. There used to be third-party companies that did that, and then Apple came along and stomped all over them. They've done the same thing with cameras and so on. This idea, I think it may be called Sherlocking, where they built Spotlight, but Sherlock was the search tool. So you have to ask yourself, will the big players in my market step on me, or can I be different enough, or at least have them acquire me? So you've now gone down the road of should you seek investment? And if the answer is no, not yet, then you have to ask yourself, if I'm not yet fundable, where is the risk? The risk is usually two kinds of risk. One, that the product is unclear. I've got this product, but I don't know if it's the right product. And so now, a really good strategy is to do some consulting to find out if the thing you're trying to sell is actually real. So you take your product or service, but instead of selling it, you start a consulting company. You just, behind the scenes, happen to be using your technology to do the consulting. So here's the way that works. You go find 10 prospects. You sell them all stuff. You try to sell them the same thing as much as possible. Because it's a consulting company or a services business, all of those clients will ask you for slightly different things. That's the nightmare of consulting. So behind the scenes, you're desperately trying to get them all to sign the same contract with the same terms for the same technology. You standardize whatever you can of that offering. And then you build the custom stuff they need for each of those clients. Maybe you have an employee who services that client, or you're writing custom code for those. But carefully, you're now learning what's custom. And what's custom is what's costly to that market. It's the reason they needed to use you as a consulting firm instead of just going and buying a technology, right? Then you standardize, automate, and patent that stuff. The 20% that was custom, you find a way to let the customer set it up themselves, or a way to get the market to change to your solution as the default standard. Because your margins, your differentiation, and your scalable growth come from your ownership of this custom layer, which you can now sell as a product. And without this, either you're a consulting firm, which is okay, maybe you become a consulting firm for a while, or the market isn't quite ready. Like the market hasn't decided on a standardized solution, so you're going to offer this consulting service, that's fine. Or the technology isn't possible yet. Advances in AI have not gotten you to a place where this can be done automatically. And that's okay because you know. And as a startup, your goal is to learn. Your goal is not to execute on the business model, it's to find the business model. So that's how you identify whether the product is unclear. So many companies I have advised, my advice to them has been, do it as a consulting business for the first 2 years. And the ones that did, almost all find a different thing from what they were going to solve and are successful. The ones that didn't, they're all out of business. If you're in the back, there's a couple of seats up here as well, and there's a few in the back there. So the second risk is, hey, I got this great product, but is the market there? Can I reach the market? Will they buy the product? A good strategy for this is to crowdfund. You can test whether or not there's demand for very little money using crowdfunding platforms. I'll talk at the end of this about what Lean UX did to crowdfund a conference in a very clever way. This is probably the most uncomfortable thing that I've ever had to talk founders through. And I have urged them to do something Ben and I call hardcore interviews. This is really uncomfortable. The way a hardcore interview works is you sit down with your prospective customer. Remember, because you're talking to lots of customers to find out if your product is real. You sit down and you interview them. Tell me about your needs. Tell me about your market, what you'd like to buy, and so on. Then you say to them at the end of the meeting, would you mind, I know you said you like this, would you mind introducing me to a friend? Can you think of someone else who would like this as much as you do? Maybe they say no. If they say no, it's a clear sign that they're being polite to you, but they don't actually love you enough to invest personal political capital in connecting to someone else. But let's say they say yes. You go, okay, would you mind calling them right now? It's awkward, right? These are hardcore. If they say no, then your offering likes what you do, but they don't want to brag, or the product make doesn't want them to brag, hey, I found this really cool thing, you got to try it out, or that contact isn't really a friend. Awkward, right? So if they say, yeah, sure, they call them and they're like, hey, I'm here with Alistair, he's got this crazy new per month Flowbee-powered haircutting salon, you should really talk to him. They pitch it. Maybe he mangles the message. That tells me that my advocates can't easily learn what I said and convey it to others. My message is not repeatable. It will not scale. But let's say they say it properly. You grab their phone. Can I talk to them? If they say no, they don't really trust you. If they say yes, you get a meeting, you should call every investor you know. If you can make it through this gauntlet 10 times, you have 10 passionate customers who will repeat what you do. This is so hard to do that when I've coached startups to do it, we always send the founding team in pairs because they keep each other honest. It is so uncomfortable. It is so uncomfortable. You know what's more uncomfortable? Losing all your money and moving back in with your parents. So do this. So assuming that you've decided you shouldn't get funding, you either need to discover the product need using consulting, or you need to crowdfund and do really awkward interviews with people that are honest to test the demand. But if you want to fund it, do you have what investors want? And if you do, you need to figure out your business model. So, what's a business model and how can I get one? A business model is defined by Peter Drucker, the sort of father of management speak, as assumptions about what a company gets paid for. That's a pretty good definition. You know what they call a product or a service without a business model? They call it a hobby. And there's nothing wrong with hobbies, but don't you dare try and ask for money for them, except, again, from your parents. There are a number of degrees of uncertainty when you launch something. You may have a market with an unmet need. Oh, that's good. I found a market without a need. I don't know what the product is yet. I don't know if it scales. I don't know if there's a business model attached. There may be a job to be done. I have an idea of the need, and I kind of know how people do it. You may have some kind of business diagram that shows how people acquire your service, pay for it, use it. You may have a business model. And then you may have a business plan. And this is kind of the spectrum of ideas of a business is. Over on the far left, you have a considerable amount of uncertainty. So you got to ask questions like, is the market even there? Is the need real and known by the market? Whereas on the other side, there's absolute certainty. And so the risk is, can you do what you say you're going to do? Can you execute on the plan? But if someone asks you for a business model, a business plan at this stage with financials and projections and a SWOT analysis and a go-to-market plan, when you're in the founding phase, remember, you have not found a business model yet. You're searching for one. Oh my God, this is way too premature. It's asking a startup at this stage for a business plan of what you're going to do in 5 years is like asking Columbus for a map of the world before he sets sail. Maybe someone a little less horrible than Columbus, but an explorer, let's say. For setting sail, your plan is to go map the world. Your plan is not to give me the map of the world and then let you go sailing. So when an investor says, give me the map of the world, you're like, no, you don't understand. You're paying for me to go sailing and draw a map. A lemonade stand's business model is pretty darn simple. I sell lemonade to people who pay more for it than the cost of my materials. And the questions, the risks are, do they have foot traffic on a particular street? What's the maximum people will pay for it? Can I charge them more if I have a doe-eyed little kid selling the thing so they take pity on them? Those are the business risks, right? Your business model should not be more complicated than a lemonade stand. So Peter Drucker, again, says the typical questions for a business model are, who is the customer and what do they value? How do we make money in this business? And what is the underlying economic logic that explains how we deliver values at an appropriate cost and make a profit? I would add 3 questions for startups. What is the competitive moat? How will you win against your competitors? How big is the market? What's the size and growth rate of your market? And is it big enough to support the 10x return on investment that your investors need? And how are you going to be mischievous? And what I mean by that is, what unfair advantage or subversive trick will let you win over others and acquire the customer, the demand, the attention better than everybody else who's had the same idea? Because if you have a good idea, 10 other people are definitely working on it. I've literally, 1 year after Lean Analytics came out, I did a bunch of talks at accelerators. I visited 6 accelerators. 4 of them had a dog walking service. And that's a pretty small sample. But do you know how many dog walking companies are out there? Everybody's got a dog and doesn't want to get up in the morning, wants a dog walking service. And so what's your mischief? What is it about you that means that people are going to flock to your dog walking service, not the thousands of others? So if you look at someone like Blockbuster, their business model was to get to scale by leveraging purchasing costs. They had stores everywhere. They were able to get very good deals on videos. In fact, they had such power in Hollywood, they could actually get people to rewrite scripts if they didn't like them, which resulted in some very strange historical alterations to famous stories. But Blockbuster's business model was get to scale, leverage costs, and standardize rentals, right? Netflix's change was, hey, monthly fee, no late fees, and no real estate costs. That was their assumptions about the business model. Even an organization like Tupperware, they had a secret. Tupperware's secret was, we're going to have parties that are actually multi-level marketing schemes. So if someone said, hey, what's your unfair advantage? And Tupperware just started out like anyone else. And then they hired a saleswoman from another company, and she figured out this strategy, and they promoted her like VP of marketing and sales. But she figured out that this was the way to acquire customers. She had a subversive tactic, which was peer embarrassment in a social setting for people who get to have dinner parties. Even James Watt, the inventor of the steam engine, who coined the term horsepower, it was actually his business partner Bolton, who was the really smart business person. Bolton said, I'm not going to charge you for the steam engine. I'm going to charge you a percentage of the money you get from making more money on my engine. His engine was more efficient. And so he basically stood up the engines, sold a few very key gears that he had patents on, and then shook them down by saying, hey, we're going to measure your thing in horsepower, and we're going to charge you for the extra horsepower you've got. Even the word horsepower was a way to make people comfortable with the idea of energy not from horses. So the real genius behind James Watt's steam engine, and the reason we refer to watts coming out of the wall, is his partner Bolton, who figured out basically force as a service. Digitas, big marketing agency. Excuse me, Michael Bronner, the founder of Digitas, started in 1980 in his dorm room. He would often buy books of discount tickets that would get him discounts at local bars and bookstores and stuff like that. And the books created value, but he realized they had actual value for the merchants. And so he realized that if he could get a coupon into every student's backpack, he was going to be rich. The first problem was that students didn't have a lot of money. And the second problem, so giving them away solves that problem. The second problem was, how do you get them to students? So he made a proposal to the dean of the University of Boston's housing department that he would assemble these coupon books and he would deliver them in bulk to all the dorm rooms. And the dean agreed. And then he went to other business owners and said, hey, I'm giving away this book to all the students. You can pay a small fee to appear in the book, and you'll get the coupons, and 14,000 people will see them. It took off. He was the first person to do this stuff. Before long, he extended this to other campuses, just like Facebook did. He started a company called Eastern Exclusives, and in his university, he was running these book coupon things across all the universities. And eventually, that became Digitas, one of the big digital marketing agencies of the world. So he found his unfair advantage in this distribution and reversed the economics of the business, where students weren't paying for it, businesses were. The second thing you need to really focus on is growth. Early on, growth is oxygen for your startup. It's either that it brings in money, that's great, but that's not the main reason. Before you're profitable, growth in users is how an investor will evaluate what you're worth. More importantly, since as a startup, your goal is to learn, users are how you learn. The more users on your site, the more experiments you can run, the more you can try ideas out. If you don't have traffic, then you can't try out ideas. So growth really is your oxygen hose. In fact, Paul Graham of Y Combinator says you better be growing at 5% a week. If you're not growing customers or revenues at 5% a week, you are probably not going to hit the escape philosophy of a startup. That's okay. It can be a lifestyle business, whatever. But if you're not growing customers or revenues at 5% a week, that's a lot. If you're not doing that, you have not found the right product market fit to hit escape velocity. Paul says startups are by definition different in the way a redwood seedling has a different destiny from a bean sprout. Your goal is to grow fast. Now, startups don't need to be tech companies, but most of them are tech companies for a bunch of reasons. Because because startup ideas either come from a new need in the market. If it was an existing need, someone would have solved it. So rapid change in one area uncovers big problems, right? Or it's a new solution. There was a problem and now technology can solve the problem in a better way. Or there's an economic shift which says that everybody needs a particular technology to make their existing business work properly. And you can now do a business model you couldn't before. Netflix wouldn't have worked without broadband or the US Postal Service. And so there has to be a shift in technology that makes a solution possible. There are three fundamental engines that you as a founder need to build and worry about. The first is the product engine. The product engine is what you build and how you structure that delivery. In a startup, remember, you're not building a product. You're building a product to figure out what product you should have built in the first place. Let me report that. You're not building a product. You're building a product to figure out what product you should have built. If your product fails, but you now know what to build, that's a very good thing. We started a company called Coradiant. Kerry Goldbach's one of my founders in the back. We started a company called Coradiant here in Montreal in 2001. We got funding. Massive Series A funding, $20 million. Gave up a whole bunch of the company to run a managed services business to compete with LoudCloud and Sitesmith and so on. It was a terrible time to launch it. All the dot-coms crashed. They didn't need our services. But in that product, we had learned that there was a need to measure the user experience of real users, their performance and the uptime of the site. That web analytics showed you what people did, but they didn't show you if they could do it, and we could solve that problem. And we basically shut down the services business and stood up this technology company that made $100,000 boxes. And we toiled in obscurity for 4 or 5 years, and then in a 6-month period, LinkedIn, Salesforce, and Fidelity bought our biggest box. That's how you know you're doing well. And then it was off to the races and we were selling those products. We would not have figured, people say to me, what's your biggest regret with CoRadiant? Well, not building that thing first, because then we would own all the company and we'd be meeting on my yacht. But we're not, or Carrie's yacht, but we're not. What we did do is we learned what we should have built in the first place. Our goal was to figure out what business we should be in, and we actually accomplished that. It just took a long time, and we all still have to work. But it was a lot of fun. So you're really trying to build a product to figure out what product to build. This is known as the minimum viable product. What's the least you need to build to prove that your market and your product is there and figure out what you should have built? It's a very different world from my product must succeed. You got to keep telling your investors and your advisors, my goal is to learn. And if they ask you, what did you learn this week? What would you change? Those are good questions for founding stage companies. Everybody forgets the word viable. So it's not just the minimum product. It has to have the function and the risk you're trying to test. If you're trying to sell to government, but you don't have the right privacy controls, you're not viable. Your tests are meaningless. Viable means you have to have that basic stuff. The basic idea behind Lean Startup, and I'm not going to get into this, there's an 1.5 hour long video online of me doing a training for Google on Lean Analytics that you're welcome to go watch. But the basic idea behind this Lean Startup movement is that you build something, you put it in the market, you measure what happened, you collect that data, you learn from it, and then you have an idea and you go through the next iteration. If you don't learn, it's not a minimum viable product. You're just lazy and didn't finish your work. Steve Blank himself says this may not work outside of Silicon Valley. It was developed, it assumes that entrepreneurs have full access to eager business customers, lots of angels, and venture capitalists with money to burn. So you need to be more creative, although I will say the Montreal investment community is amazing. The number of funds being launched for seed stage, we live in one of the best cities for getting that early stage funding and experimenting stuff. You may need to go beyond it, but right now in Montreal, this is an amazing time to launch a business. So how do you find that product? One way is what we call the idea maze. If you've been in an industry for 10 years, you probably know a lot about it. I've been running conferences for like 20 years. I have so many ideas on event technology that I could go launch because I've been in that world. Now, the risk is I'm also in a filter bubble. I have my own view of the world. I think it applies to everyone. But the reality is this idea maze that we're trying to navigate is a pretty complex one. How do we get through that? So if you've been in an industry for 10 or 15 years, but you still look at it with the fresh eyes of what is now possible, you may find new examples of that. Dr. Gary Hoberman, who is the CIO at MetLife. MetLife is an insurance company, the ones with the Snoopies on the doghouse. How many people here have a strong emotional relationship with insurance companies that doesn't include they denied my claim? It's not the kind of, it's like telcos, right? You sort of wake up in the morning and you're just angry or they did their job. It's really hard to love a telco. It's really hard to love an insurance company. But Gary stepped back and said, insurers are not in the business of paying when something bad happens. They are the organization you trust more than anyone else to know someone is dead. Think about it. Who has the most financial incentive to know that someone's definitely died or definitely experienced an accident? It's an insurance company. And so with that in mind, and with them being an organization you trust to take action after your death, when someone dies, the insurance company pays out. They have to act on your behalf after death. So Gary said, I'm going to reframe the business. They launched something called MetLife Infinity. MetLife Infinity is a pretty amazing product. This is a prototype for them. They built it in a few weekends. Let me read you. I'm going to squint at this because it's a little hard to read. It says, Pop's 60th birthday, my collections, our favorite holiday, our first time away together as a family. A video message for my wife, saying goodbye to you, my love. Pictures for the grandkids, photos of you growing up, so proud of you. Is that the first time you've had an emotional connection with an insurance company? Right. That's the idea maze. If you're in insurance for 10 or 15 years and you have the ability to step back and look at the pattern, I don't pay out. I know when people have an unfortunate event and act on their behalf when they're unable to do so. What else could I do? I could curate that. So that's a good way to find a product. Stepped way back in an industry and said, what else could be done based on that framing? A second one is simplification. It is astonishing to me how many great startups can be built just on simplifying something. DJ Patil has this idea of the zero overhead principle. He says, building for enterprise in particular, no feature may add training costs to the user. If you do something, training costs better go down. Think about Zoom. I mean, we have Google Hangouts and all these other things, but Zoom just seems to work. They didn't do anything new. They just did it well. There's a famous quote about Dropbox. Everyone knew that cloud storage was a solved problem. Fortunately, the founders of Dropbox didn't know that. They just made it really simple. So simplifying a very complex space with what is now available in technology is another really important way to find a product. A third is something I refer to as currency exchanges. On the internet, there are three kinds of currencies. The first is money, an obvious form of currency. The second is attention, who we're paying attention to. We literally pay attention. And reputation, and then attention. So reputation is like what people think of you. Do they trust you and so on? Do you have a lot of followers? Are you seen as an expert in something? And attention is, does this thing get attention? The interaction of money, reputation, and attention is what's happening for political discourse on Twitter. People are doing things to get attention, which leads to reputation that they can then monetize. And so there's an exchange that happens online between these three things. You can probably tell by now I love three circles as pictures. I'm probably going to get a tattoo of those three circles and just carry around a Sharpie and people can like write the three things in. If you have reputation and you decide to cash that reputation, and that's endorsement or product placement. If you have money and you want reputation, that's patronage or philanthropy. If you have money and you want attention, you run ads or you lobby. If you have attention, you turn it into money, that's sales conversion. If you have reputation and you want it to turn it into attention, that's organic search, word of mouth, and virality. If you have attention, you want to turn to reputation, that's heroism and selflessness. The reason that big tech firms like Google are so lucrative is that they play in all three of these. They are exchanges that extract some amount of value from every one of these transactions. And I know this is a bit of an eye chart. I think the pinned tweet on my Twitter feed, which is @acroll, is this picture. So if you want to see it in more detail, go look at this. You can look at those three things, at the interaction between attention, reputation, and money, and figure out if you can form an exchange that transfers one into another. That's a good way to think about business models. Another way to find a product is to say, what now hurts? Taxi cabs don't like Uber. I have no sympathy for taxi cabs, because imagine thinking you can't improve on this user interface. For years, being able to hail a cab on the street was a feature. I don't own a car, I don't have a personal driver, but if I stick my hand out, someone will pick me up. That was their user interface, and when taxis started, that was amazing. Like, can you imagine the ads for taxis when they started? Stick your hand out and someone will pick you up. Oh my God, that's amazing, right? But in most industries, a thing that was an advantage, like Blockbuster saying, you can bring your movies back late and we'll just charge you a late fee, which was an advantage, has now become a liability. Blockbuster optimized its pricing to make sure that it was just slightly cheaper than the annoyance of having to take that video home. Taxi cabs, instead of building something to let people hail them on the corner, force their customers to stand in the rain while focusing on price anchoring trips to get you to tip more. In every industry, technology comes along that makes something that used to be a feature into a source of customer pain, and deriving money from customer pain is always bad in the long term. Another way to find a product is to ask, what is now possible? Take hashtags, for example. Hashtags are much bigger deals than we think. And just so you all know, Chris Messina, who invented the hashtag, he's actually the person who invented the hashtag, is speaking on Thursday or Friday. Awesome person. He's here in town for a while. Try and grab him if you can. Chris was the person that got Twitter to build hashtags as a system. Hashtags cannot work without search technology. But hashtags have only scratched the surface of a much more fundamental human thing. So here are some brief thoughts on hashtags, and you're welcome to go start a business around this. In the 16th century, the Medici was a family that focused on mercantile exchange, banking, loans, and so on. And the Medici had a way of keeping track of stuff. They used things like the general ledger, the idea of balance of credits and debits, They have the balance sheet and the income statement. These all grew out of the double ledger record keeping that the Medici had started to keep track of debts. If you have a balance sheet, it's got line items, right? It's got like real estate and payroll, and it's got marketing costs and so on. Everything's built into those. So let's say I have a cup of coffee, and I wish I had a cup of coffee. Where would I file my coffee? Do I file it under people, and it's Alistair's cup of coffee? Do I file it under beverages? It's Alistair's coffee cup? Do I file it under containers? It's Alistair's cup of coffee. We all know that it's all three things, right? But that's not how filing systems work. Filing systems say put the cup of coffee under people, beverages, or containers. That's how every accounting system works. That's how your file folders work on your computer until you start using search. That's how all accounting works. Now, I might be able to say this coffee came from Starbucks, or this coffee is excellent, or this coffee has cream. Those are additional pieces of context about the coffee. Imagine trying to file my coffee cup. I could make 2 other coffee cups and put them in the 3 places, one under people, one under beverages, one under containers. Now I change the one in containers, the other 2 out of date, my filing doesn't work. Which means that the Medici's model requires that there be one and only one atomic example of that. But that's not how humans think, and that's not how information works. Me saying this is coffee is objectively provable through chemical analysis of what's in my hand. Me saying it's lousy is subjective, and that tag may have less value. Hashtags are a consequence of abundant, cheap search, but they are nothing less than a fundamental change in how we store and apply context and set information. They're a side effect of search. Show me an accounting system based on hashtags instead of the general ledger. That's a pretty fucking huge opportunity nobody's solved yet. When people say, oh, all the good ideas are done, this is a fundamental issue, and we haven't changed everything about business that takes data and requires it to be in one place and puts it everywhere. We're starting to. But again, when you step way back and you say, what is now possible, I don't think we've scratched the surface on the shift from folders to tags. It's going to change everything about how business is done, how we trust content we see online, and so on, and we're only just starting. Another way to find the right product is to reframe the conversation. You should choose a frame that benefits you. These are 2 Olympic gold medalists. One's a gymnast, one's a swimmer. Can you guess which is which? Because one of them has like a 3-foot head start before she leaves the diving blocks. And the other one can rotate much, much faster because she doesn't have as long a big an axis of rotation, and so she can spin more quickly. If you're a medalist, compete in the sport that you're best able to compete in. In the car industry, for decades, electric cars were sold as more sustainable. They were sold based on their range, on how good they were for the environment. And then Tesla came along and said, no, you idiots, it's about performance. That's a way more fun thing to talk about. So they post a bunch of videos of what looks like a family sedan destroying a bunch of supercars. They reframed the conversation. To a certain market, electric cars were now about being really fast. Performance, right? When Gmail launched, do you know how much storage Hotmail and Outlook, Hotmail and Yahoo Mail had? 10 megabytes. Anybody here got a photo on their phone that's bigger than 10 megabytes? That was your entire inbox, which meant you had a whole bunch of folders. Again, folders, not hashtags, which meant that you had to curate those things and archive them and delete them all the time. Google was like, no. Mail's about abundant storage. They were so keen to emphasize this that when you sign up, it has a rolling counter. This one says 2,290.52 megabytes and counting. And that number increases as you sit on the page. Google did everything they could to say, forget email being about filing and structure and folders. Email's about storage. Never delete anything again. And they knew they could do this because of search, because otherwise those folders would be a nightmare, but they destroyed everybody else. Gmail launched incredibly fast. It's now become the log file of our online lives. You give me access to your email, I can build a profile of you immediately. They reframed what mail was about, just like Tesla reframed what electric cars are about. Avis famously ran this campaign that said, we're number 2, so we try harder. They changed it from going with the big vendor to how hard someone is willing to compete for your business. Salesforce. Their logo said no software. Even though Salesforce has its own programming language called Apex, they changed it, and Heroku, which is Rails, right? Their logo said no software because they made CRM not about feature richness, but about how little you need IT to deploy it. By the way, they knew that a web-based system could not be as powerful as a desktop system, so they took advantage of this to reframe themselves as the solution that was easy to deploy, because they knew they'd lose on the solution that was feature-rich. Listerine did the same thing for, Scope did the same thing for mouthwash. For years, Listerine was medical, so much so that the founder of Listerine coined the term Listerine because it sounded like a medicine. So then they ran scratch and sniff ads and said, no, it's about having a sexy smell. Strollers were rebranded recently as engineered portable parenting solutions that have multiple coffee cup holders, batteries in them, Wi-Fi hotspots. It's crazy if you're buying a stroller. The fact that this is made by McLaren, a race car company, already tells you they changed their market, right? So that's your product engine and some ways to find good products. Your customer engine is how you go and get your customers. And customers, your growth comes from the actions of those customers. So there's 3 things you need to find those customers able to do. The first is you need stickiness. If I acquire customers and they stick around, I will grow. Sustainable means I don't have to work on it and the business still persists. If my customers stick around once I acquire them, the business has longevity. If my customers tell others, this is the only clip art I could find for virality, if my customers tell others about it, then the business will continue to grow. And if I have revenue coming in that I can spend on sales teams or advertising, my company will continue to grow. Sustainability, a sustainable business is one that can grow based on the actions of its customers, not its team. If you're still, and early on, you're going to have to force it, you're going to have to subsidize it, but longer term, is the business sustainable enough to continue growing on its own without the actions of the founders? Which means you got to move people through something where you acquire customers, you activate them, you get revenue from them, you retain them, and you make them refer others. And the real question is, can you move enough customers through a cycle like this to make more money than you spend? Now, I'm going to show you a bit of an eye chart. This is a lean analytics diagram. Again, you can find a lot of these online. If you go to slideshare.net/lean analytics, you'll find these talks. In this diagram, and it's a bit of an eye chart, but you can see over here, I got a visitor that I acquire. They become a test user. If they're engaged, they might convert to a paying customer. At some point, that test user is going to abandon the test, or that paying customer is going to cancel the service. And during their lifetime, do they invite others? You need to be able to draw this. Remember I said you don't need a business plan, but you need a business model? Your goal is to draw a diagram that looks something like this for your clients. There are a couple more seats up here, and there's a couple over there. If you're getting tired in the back, there's one up the front here. So that's all well and good. I've got the sustainable business, but I need attention. I need market attention. There's a guy named Herbert Simon in the 1970s who said we don't live in an information economy because information is abundant and economies are driven by what's scarce. And what information consumes is our attention. My favorite example, the classic example of this, is Hotmail. Hotmail put this line in the bottom of their emails saying get your free private email at http://hotmail.com. And lo and behold, every recipient, every time you sent a message, you were sending out a possible way of acquiring new customers. The growth of Hotmail adoption very closely mirrors something called the Bass diffusion curve of how messages are disseminated. This is a product management thing about information dissemination. But we've seen lots of examples of this since then. Farmville grew to millions of users by essentially writing an app that would send unsolicited messages to all your friends in the Facebook network saying, Alistair needs some grain, click here to play. And Facebook stopped this after a little while, but that was their go-to-market strategy. Remember I said that subversive thing? That was their subversion. They subverted Facebook friend feeds as a way of propagating their product. By the time Facebook cut them off, they had 30 million users in a couple of months. Tinder. When Tinder launched, one of the founders, who was from the Greek letter societies, traveled around the Northeast giving talks on entrepreneurship at sororities. As part of those talks, she would encourage all the women in the sororities to install the app, and then she'd go to a party across the road at one of the fraternities and say, hey, all the sisters are on this app. She came back with 14,000 users. Pretty subversive. So the question that I ask founders when I'm talking to them, more than anything else, what platform can you subvert to create attention you can turn into profitable demand? Tupperware subverted the dinner party. Tinder subverted the Greek letter societies. Farmville subverted the friend feed. What are you going to subvert to create attention you can turn into profitable demand? I told you earlier that I was going to tell you the biggest risk. The biggest risk, I guarantee you, even if you say this isn't you, the biggest risk to your startups is that 90% of you have not figured out how to create attention you can turn into profitable demand better than your competitors. If 80% of the risk is creating attention, 80% of your day should be spent on creating attention. And I guarantee you, most of you are spending 80% of your day building your product, because that's your comfortable, happy place full of things you control. And being in a startup, founding a startup, is an incredibly uncomfortable thing. I ask you you're going to go out and you're going to ask more of people than you feel comfortable doing. You're going to show them things you don't feel are quite ready yet. You're going to lie about how much of your functionality exists to test the market. It's really, really uncomfortable, but necessary. You also need what's called a paradoxical market. So we're going to come back to my friend James Watt. In the dawn of the coal era, the industrial era, the engine of choice was something called Newcomen's atmospheric engine. And this was pumping the water out of the coal mines so the British could mine more coal, which they were then using to further the industrial empire. And this guy, William Stanley Jevons, was asked by the British government to measure how much coal was left, because the empire was running on that coal. And so they told him to go out and look at how much coal was coming out of the ground, how fast it was there, how much reserves are left, and so on. And during his work, along came James Watt. And Watt's engine had an expansion and a compression phase, and it had 2 cylinders. So for the same amount of coal, it was 4 times as efficient. That means it uses 75% less coal. That's pretty good, right? According to every economist at the time, that means that England's coal reserve should last 4 times longer. If you have a car that consumes a quarter of the gas, you can drive 4 times as far, right? If you have a car that consumes 4 times as much gas, you should expect your gas bill to go down by 75%, right? But it doesn't. Because as Jevons found, consumption was accelerating. And so he asked this question, shouldn't more efficiency mean less consumption? He probably phrased it differently from me, but this was a really weird thing. And so what he learned was that more efficiency means lower costs, which creates new uses, which means more demand, which means more consumption. Put another way, sometimes supply creates more demand. This is known as Jevons' paradox. You, as a startup founder, are after a paradoxical market where the more supply you introduce, the more demand you create. Smartphones are a great example for this. Anything with network effects works well here. If you can find a market where supply creates more demand, you will expand the total addressable market. Investors that say, tell me your total addressable market, I think are full of it. What you want to say is, how will you create a market that grows itself? They should be looking for, tell me why your market is paradoxical. What is it about your market that as you make this stuff more available, you will increase consumption? That's the best way to grow a large business. And the third and slightly less sexy example, there's product engine, which is what you build. There's customer engine, which is how you get to market. And there's company engine. But ultimately in a company, it's all profit and loss. The company engine is the domain of the CFO and the COO and the head of HR. You have some unavoidable fixed costs of running your business. You have some discretionary fixed costs. And then you have variable costs. If you bring in revenues that exceed your variable costs, you are master of your destiny. If you bring in revenues that are lower than that, you're in horrible misery. The board talks about replacing you. You can't innovate on stuff. You don't have spare money to reinvest in the business. A lot of people think that what's going to make a company work is intellectual property. One of the most common mistakes that naive founders make is asking an investor to sign an NDA. First of all, the investor won't, because they might talk to someone else like you, and they can't possibly keep track of all the investments. Second of all, you've just told them that you think your idea and not your ability to execute is valuable. You've just shown them that you don't understand how the world works. You can be free with your ideas, be secretive about your go-to-market strategy. If you're Tinder, tell them about your dating site, but be careful who you tell about visiting the Greek societies, because that go-to-market, which is the real risk, your subversive tactic, that's the thing that you need to take them aside after they're invested and say, listen, now that you're on board, here's what we're doing and this is why it's cool. That's the piece you got to keep quiet. Sometimes intellectual property is good. Usually it's done to maximize the valuation. If a company is acquiring another company, They may want their patents so that they can trade them or use them in the market. It may be a way to create unreasonable profits for something because you've invested in it up front. So obviously it creates barriers to entry. In the drug industry, this is a big deal. And also it's a good source of negotiation. So you're horse trading. If you have a competitor and they accuse you and you accuse them, you can kind of trade off and license patents to one another. So the first thing to think about is how you grow your intellectual property. But the second thing is, how do you raise money? This is a very weird thought experiment, but the best time to raise money is every morning. That is one huge assumption, which is that you're growing. But if you're growing, you can raise money every day. You're worth a certain amount, and you have a certain amount of burn each day that you need to pay off with investment, which means the amount of money left to you is what you now own. Now, if you can't, obviously you can't close money every morning, but the longer you close money for, let's say I have a business worth $5 million, I go get $2 million of investment. That'll last me a couple of years. At the end of the 2 years, let's say I'm worth $50 million. Wouldn't it have been better for me to raise like the last part of that and to do two chunks, one of $1 million and one of $1 million? This one valued at the valuation of $5 million, and this one at $15 million? Much less dilution. So people who say go out and raise a lot of money, you have to balance the trade-off between going out and raising, which takes your mind off the business, and asking for so much, you dilute yourself in advance of growth. So in a kind of stupid way of remembering that, the best time to close money is every morning. And you need to understand money as a founder. So what's debt? Debt is I loan you money and I get it back with interest. Then there's convertible debt. I loan you money, I might get it back with interest, but I'm probably going to have it convert to shares at a discounted rate. There's equity. I buy part of the business. I have a say in how it's run. And then there's options, which is I can pay today's price for the sale of shares later, but I have no opinion. As a founder, you need to be familiar with these four things, or you'll get stymied in negotiations and people will take advantage of you. How will they take advantage of you? Probably through dilution. The dirty secret to startups is that as you go and get funding, your share of the company goes down dramatically. In a pre-seed company, if you have 3%, by the time you've done a Series B, your shares are worth 0.43% of the company. So it better have grown at least 6 times for you to have just the same amount of money, just to break even. Be aware of the impact of dilution. The most important thing to remember about this is called leverage. Let's say you have a return on investment of 8%. If it costs you 10% to go and get money, you're much better off getting equity investors because you don't have to pay them interest. On the other hand, if you can borrow money at 6%, but you're making money at 8%, this part is yours to keep. Leverage is when you can make more money than the cost of money, so you get that money from a loan and pay it back, and you hold on to the equity yourself. Some other things to think about with the company engine is what kind of CEO are you? In my experience, there are 3 kinds of CEOs. There's a product CEO. The product CEO says, hey, if the product is awesome, everything will work out. Obviously, this person focuses on the product engine we talked about earlier. I am a product CEO, by the way. I think that if you build a perfect product, it's just going to work. I've learned this about myself very painfully and worked to bring on people who are the other kinds. The second kind is a sales CEO. The sales CEO basically says, if we just get customers, everything will be fine. They have no idea about standardization. They bring you incredibly different and disruptive customers. Often you have to get rid of those customers. They're a nightmare to support. And the third kind is a finance CEO who just says, if we just get the perfect business model, everything will be okay. And the dirty secret is that they're all wrong, right? The reality is they may all be wrong, but they're all necessary. And so when you are running a company, you need these 3 functions. You need to know yourself and know which one is you. The second thing I like to tell founders is this idea of your roles in executing a business. You may not have many employees, but you will, as a founder, wear many hats. And the first hat you're going to wear is the hacker hat. This is someone who makes things real, builds things, but finds the lazy angle. From an engineering point of view, they are willing to incur technical debt because they know they're going to need to refactor code once they've figured it out. Remember, you're learning what business you should be in. If you're learning what business you should be in, then you're going to incur technical debt now because you're going to refactor for the thing you should have built in the first place. The second person is the hustler who builds buzz, finds deals, and so on. Then there's the designer who handles every aspect of human interaction, from the title of an email to the layout of a web page. And then there's the analyst The first three are from a famous post by Dave McClure, hacker, hustler, designer. I told him that without the analyst, the group doesn't stay honest. The analyst measures what the other three are doing and tells them if they're on track. And then there's a fifth role, which is the founder. And the reason this is important is that these four roles are working on your business, and this work, sorry, I put this backwards. These four roles are working in your business, and the founder is working on your business. And so when you're working in your business, that's the day-to-day grind. But you have to step back a minute, because the people working in the business, the hacker, the hustler, the designer, the analyst, their product is the thing they're making, and their customer is the target customer or the market. But the CEO, the founder, their product is the company they're creating, and their customer is all the people who might acquire that company for money. 1 day out of 5, as a founder, step back from working in the business and work on the business. Now my product is the company, and all of a sudden, things like what language you use, which nobody cared about as a customer, what programming language, now matters a lot, because if I'm using AWS, Microsoft might not acquire me. That's not a concern when I'm delivering to customers, but it's a concern when I talk about selling the company. So you have to step back and do that stuff, right? So I'd like to wrap up with this, that as a startup, you have a tremendous number of weaknesses. People will say bad things to you, and those weaknesses are all strengths. If you're inexperienced, oh, they're inexperienced, they don't know the market, they have no background here. That's great. I'm not going to play by the rules. There was a study that Malcolm Gladwell cited in David and Goliath, where a researcher looked at, over history, across 200 wars fought between a big army and a small army, he looked at who won. If they used normal tactics, the big army won 3/4 of the time. If they used unconventional tactics, the small army won 2/3 of the time. Draw your own conclusions, but you are a fool to not try and do something that is different from the status quo or the rules. Remember, you're here to disrupt. If you just do what everyone else does, you're just an entrepreneur. You should go work for them. Maybe you're good at that. You're here to disrupt. So when someone says you're inexperienced, you say, that's right, I don't play by the rules. I don't know the rules yet. I'm not biased by them. I'm going to go crush you. Someone says, oh, you're brand new. You haven't been in the market for a while. Okay. You know what? Back in the day, you had to pay a lot for software. Now it's free. The earliest known use of Google as a transitive verb on American television was in Buffy the Vampire Slayer in October of 2002. Trivia you didn't know you were going to get at Startupfest. Willow says, have you Googled her yet? That show was so far ahead of its time. So, when you look at this, you have the ability to Google a competitor. You have the ability to pay for computing by the second. You have the ability to post stuff on Twitter for free. Give me Google 30 years ago, I will immediately get the presidency or prime ministership. I will immediately take out all my competitors. Can you imagine Google, if you had Google and no one else did 30 years ago? The only way to find out what your competitor is doing was to hire their salespeople or wait for their quarterly report. Now you just go look at their website. You, as a founder who's new to the industry, can use new emerging technologies that everyone else is dependent on legacy stuff. That's awesome. They might say, oh, you have no channels. Okay, that means I have no channel conflict. Tesla is a new car startup, so they're selling their cars on the web. Their dealerships are in malls. You order the car, you go to a place to pick it up. There's no dealership. Because Tesla didn't have a channel, they don't have to care about channel conflict. They're not entangled in all those constraints. Someone says, oh, you're really small? That's great, I can be hyper-focused. In the early days of Facebook, Facebook did not have groups. So a company called Circle of Friends emerged to provide that functionality. And they onboarded like 10 million users. The idea was that you go set up a group for your church group or your baseball team, and 10 million people set up a group. But almost nobody came back. Those groups just sat there quiet, like ghost houses on the internet. And the founder was pretty desperate, so he started going through all of the groups to see which ones had activity. And he found that all the ones with mothers in them had way higher engagement, higher activity, higher invitation, more likely to click through, higher number of images, longer threaded conversations, all the things he wanted. He changed the company's name to Circle of Moms. He took the company from 10 million users to 500,000 users. Can you imagine a board meeting? I want to get rid of 95% of my customers. By the way, I'd still like to be CEO. For some reason, they let him do it. Circle of Moms grew to 4 million. He sold it to Sugar. He was small, but hyper-focused. Someone says you have no customers. Great. I'll give you freedom to experiment. These are two video games. The one on the left is called Game Never Ending. The one on the right is called The Glitch. The one on the left was a augmented reality game that you played, and you'd go and look at the world, and you'd go add photos of the places to complete quests. And people kept adding photos. So the founders went, we have a photo sharing site, and they turned into Flickr. And then they sold Flickr to Yahoo. They worked there for a while. They left, and they said, we're going to build this new game called Glitch, but we're all distributed around the world. We need a way to chat about it and work together because we're all rich from Flickr now, and that became Slack. So this slide just shows you that Stuart Butterfield cannot build a video game. But it underscores this message, freedom to experiment. When you don't have customers, you can go do crazy stuff. When you have a lot of users, it's very hard to change because you've made a pact with those users that you'll deliver a product or service. If you don't have any existing business, that means you want the future sooner. Blockbuster had streaming video before Netflix. Think about that. Blockbuster had streaming video before Netflix. Both Netflix and Blockbuster had gone and looked at how much broadband was available because that limited how many people could watch a movie online. And Blockbuster said, oh good, there's not a lot of video available. We won't really make money off streaming for a long time. We can continue our rental stores. And Netflix went, oh, bad. We need video. We need to do something else. And they came up with the idea of stuffing DVDs in postal envelopes. Netflix wanted the future to be here sooner because they had no customers. As a startup, you want the future to be here sooner, and the incumbents don't. That's a huge advantage. If you have no team, you can experiment with contractors or changes in culture. You can use on-demand workforces. You have an amazing ability to play around with culture much more than people did before companies came in. You can work on the diversity in an organization from the outset. You're not dealing with an existing team. You can work on experimentation with different tools and different products, different processes. Whereas when a company is big, those things are entrenched. It's much harder to change. If you have no resources, that forces you to do things by hand, to be smarter about your market. Years ago, we started a company here in Montreal called Year One Labs. It was a year-long startup accelerator. Went really well, 5 companies in it. We only did it 1 year. It was a great experiment. The angels asked us to do it again. The people that backed it, and we said, it's way too much work. One of the companies, called Local Mind, their idea was to ask questions about a place. So normally you would build an app, you'd get a bunch of users, and then you try asking them questions and see how many answers you got. There's 3 months of your life gone, and you're wondering why no one uses your app. But one of the 3 rules of Year One Labs was you may not write any code for your first month. I can tell you this gave all of the participants hives. Like coding is their happy place. Building things, designing stuff. We said, you're not allowed to use a computer. Just not allowed to use a computer, not allowed to write code. So they went and looked at all the tweets coming out of Times Square that were geofenced, and then every one of those people, they'd ask them a question. Hey, is the weather nice? Is there coffee there? What's the Wi-Fi like? 94% of people responded within 5 minutes. So their risky assumption, will people answer a question from a stranger, they validated in 1 morning instead of 3 months. They did it by hand. Just so you know, Local Mind was acquired by Airbnb. All of the Airbnb experiences stuff is a result of theirs. And one of the 3 employees of Local Mind, Nelson Gauthier, is the only person at Airbnb allowed to touch code in production in an emergency. If you're a coder, you know what that means. You get to touch production. That's 3 people who found the right business model because they didn't code. They did the hard things by hand to learn, and that allowed them to validate or repudiate their assumptions much faster than everyone else. If you have no burn, you can test demand for free. I'll tell you a quick story about Lean UX. So when Lean Analytics came out, we wanted to go speak publicly about the book, and I got a message from Lean UX saying, would you come talk at our conference? I said, sure. And I learned that they took a lean startup approach to their conference. They realized, what's the riskiest thing about a conference? It's you. It's the audience showing up. And I'm pleased to say, you're standing in the back, sorry for the lack of seats, but this is a great example of something that works. But even we aren't great at figuring this stuff out because we book the venue and we work on it and so on. What Lean UX did is they said, oh, what's the least risky thing about a conference? It's can you book space? Because everybody will sell you space, right? You can definitely book space. So what they did is they started a mailing list. And they said, if we can get 1,000 people on our mailing list, then we're going to try and launch a conference. They got their mailing list to 1,000 people with good content and interviews and so on. They said, okay, we're going to offer tickets using a crowd-funded ticketing tool where I'm going to bill you $500 for your ticket, but I'm not going to charge you until we've sold 300 of them. They got to 300 sales. Everything's great. They billed everybody. Then they called a bunch of people like me and said, hey, will you come and speak for the cost of air travel plus a nice bottle of scotch? Like, all right, sure. So they've de-risked all the risky stuff. Can I sell tickets? Can I find speakers? Then they opened the sales up. They said, hey, we got these speakers coming. We've already sold 300 tickets. Here's how to buy a ticket. They sold about 400 more. Now they're at 700 people. Now they know they need a venue for 700 people on or around the date they said. They go find a venue. It turns out it was in New Jersey instead of New York. They gave people who'd bought a conditional ticket 72 hours to then go and cancel their ticket, about 5% canceled. Now they have about 670 people confirmed. They've booked a space, and there was no risk. There's no risk nobody showed up. There's no risk they were left holding a contract for an empty room. There was no risk they couldn't find speakers. There was no risk. They took a lean approach. They knew deep down inside what the real risks were. They prioritized those risks, and they de-risked them systematically. That is what you have to do as founders. So I'm going to leave you with one quick story. This is the conveyor belt in the Houston airport. And Houston, if you'll pardon my pun, had a problem. But no Apollo fans here? Come on. So planes were landing, and they were surveying customers, and the customers consistently said, our biggest complaint is we have to wait too long for our bags. So the city spent tens of millions of dollars overhauling the conveyor belt system. They got the average bag time from 9 minutes down to 6 minutes, which is amazing. And then they surveyed people, and the number one complaint was, I have to wait too long for my bags. And then some enterprising civil servant got permission to park the planes further away from the baggage handling carousel, and complaints went to zero. Because they weren't saying my bags take too long. They said I have to wait too long for my bags. They were okay with walking for a few minutes from the plane because they'd been sitting down for a while. Be that person. Don't be the administrator who spends tens of millions of dollars. Try that stuff first. It doesn't cost. It tells you what your assumptions are. It de-risks the problem. Really understand the problem. Try a simple, hacky solution that you know won't be sustainable, and verify the problem. So this was kind of a roller coaster ride through a lot of startup concepts. I crammed together things from the last 10 years of experience into one deck. Hopefully it was useful. A couple of things. Turn around, everybody. Look behind you. See that? Évaluer les séances, rate the sessions. So I spent hours and hours putting this together, and I spent years and years learning the stuff to put it together. I would appreciate 2 or 3 minutes of your time on your way out. Scan that QR code. Rate me. If it was bad, tell me it was bad. If it was good, tell me it was bad. But please give us information, because we are also a startup, and we are also learning, and we need to know what works and doesn't. If you felt like this was a lot of content, the good news is you got 2 days to listen to people way smarter than me from around the world, from some of the world's most prominent companies. People who have literally lived their lives in this. Rosie in the back. Hi, Rosie. Groupon. Tell me all the companies. So yeah, Homebase, Groupon. I mean, you have people who've built the Open Table, the restaurant site. You have people who've headed up product at these companies that you all know by name. And they're here for the next 2 days. This is probably the best founding content I have ever seen on stage. I'm thrilled to be able to bring it to you here. I'm thrilled that you are all here. I'm going to shut up now and let our next speaker come up. But the reality is, if you pay attention to the stuff you learned today and tomorrow in this workshop, you are dramatically more likely to succeed and thrive than anybody who doesn't ask dark, hard, honest questions about themselves and take steps to mitigate those risks early on. Because if you do so, you are likely to be sitting on that side of the room next year, because it's the right place to be and you'll be seeking funding. Here's how to reach me. Croll is my Twitter, which is the best way to yell at me. If you have questions, I'll be around all week. I'm the loud guy on stage in the bright shorts. Thank you all very much.